It's time for episode 3 finally. This episode is on the feminine principle. Now, I'm a man, so first off, what is a man doing talking about the feminine principle? Second of all, the feminine principle doesn't like to be in the spotlight all the time. Third of all, I do have people here, and I want to involve them as much as possible in this episode because it's only nice when you're talking about the feminine to include everybody. It's consistent, in my personal opinion, with the feminine principle. So, if you'll all say a brief hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. Yeah, so this whole lecture, I wore the blue shirt. It's a moon. It's sort of like, imagine the twilight with the moon glistening over the water. That's sort of, that's getting into the feminine principle. So even the whole idea of a principle, like a principle in and of itself is kind of a masculine thing. It's a principle. So if you're talking about the feminine principle, it's a little, I think, strange to talk about a principle that's feminine. Because the feminine, by definition, at least by my definition, it likes to avoid being defined. It's getting away from being defined. The idea of a lecture, also somewhat masculine. Here I am standing with a long, often pre-written set of words, which are going to tell you what the thing is. So the idea of a lecture is also somewhat masculine. So the goal with this episode is to somehow creatively counteract all of these forces, which are sort of like by the nature of this TV series, like a little bit, the fact that it's a lecture leaning towards masculinity. I can start by saying my notes for this lecture are even less coherent than the 2 previous lectures. I have a few readings, but I do have a nice list of various things which I think are associated with the feminine. So, first of all, suppose you're chasing a deer in the woods, and it's back in the days when you didn't have guns or anything like that, and the deer is always, you see it and then it escapes again, and it's constantly, it might be in view for a little bit, but it leaves view also. So this is the image of the feminine. This is like what I think of as the feminine. Like the feminine is on the border between what you can clearly see and what is immersed in darkness. I'd like to thank my host Krista for being willing to host the event, and if you want to host Unlicensed Psychology, you may. I just need to know about it. So thank you. Another thing I wanted to say was that I'm going to be taking Unlicensed Psychology to the streets. I'm going to have a little sign, and I believe I'm going to be one of many vendors at First Friday, which is in a couple days, in downtown Philadelphia, on about 2nd Street or so, where they have the vendors. Street vendors, art, little trinkets. I'm going to try to be a street psychologist. And I don't really know how to do it, just like I barely know how to do these lectures. But I just wanted to say that because if you know how to make signs, I'm going to need a sign. Yeah, so the feminine principle, the whole idea is kind of, it's a contradiction. I mean, the whole feminine principle is about not being known. So I'm going to talk about things that I think they evoke the feminine principle. But you can't walk around claiming to know the feminine principle. It's like a contradiction in terms. Like all consciousness, it's like if your consciousness is a spotlight, well, the feminine is what's on the edge of the spotlight, and often outside in the complete darkness. So I want to try to invoke that. I want to try to invoke this feeling of being on the fringes, in the darkness. Any feedback so far? Any comments, things that are bubbling up? Anything bubbling up? I want the feedback. I don't even like this lecture thing. Let's see if anybody has anything.
The feminine principle might be unknown only by someone who's not feminine or a woman.
The feminine, I'm just, because the camera may or may not have heard that, the feminine principle may be unknown to somebody who's not a woman. Yeah, so one thing about making principles, instead of just defining femininity as women per se, like women are, because they are the females of the species, therefore are the living definition of the feminine principle. That's possible. Like, the thing though is that there's no idea to be talked about then. All you can do is just show a woman. Show one woman, and then show another woman, and then show another woman, in order to define the feminine. There's no idea at all.
So when you talk about the feminine principle being on the fringes and in the darkness, that sounds like the way that our masculine focused culture has sort of defined femininity. Well, there's a whole other way of looking at femininity as something that has a wholeness and fullness of itself, which I'm anticipating you getting to other versions of.
I know the microphone gain is going to be bad when somebody's directly behind the microphone. And I had wanted to do this. I wanted to get into a crowd, and I think I'm just going to go to the crowd situation right away, because that will. That's better.
Sit on the couch? No,
yeah.
Don't come sit on that couch. Camera focused on it.
So, yeah. Okay. So not everybody wants to be on camera. So until I become so popular that people are tearing at my clothes to be on the same film with me. In other words, today it's just going to be me and the camera. But I think the microphone will pick up people who are talking better right now. So if you don't mind, do you have any interest in saying that again?
So the first thing that came to mind when you said the feminine principle is on the fringes and even outside and in the darkness is that's what parts of our culture have said the feminine is as an other and outside, and not the core, not something that has a wholeness of itself. And I think there is another way of looking at the feminine principle. And I don't know how you're planning on defining the feminine principle, but
yeah.
I hope that there is a sense of wholeness and an understanding of feminine, what we tend to define as feminine, as something that is worthwhile and solid and potentially complete in itself. I don't know saying that. But.
Well, what's interesting, the way Jung sort of so the problem being that if you define the feminine as something that which is always sort of pulling back from the spotlight, how do you arrive at completeness? How do you arrive at how could you possibly arrive that femininity is good, or it's whole and complete and self-sufficient unto itself?
Boy,
right?
Go ahead.
Did I correctly?
I guess I question the definition of it as a drawing back from the spotlight.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be defined in relation to the spotlight?
Historically, a lot of the feminine has been defined that way by men.
I think that's sort of my case in point, is that when you're looking at it as this is the definition as defined by a man.
I would also say, though, that with all of the new version of women, the women that are completely self-reliant, unlike throughout most of civilization, various places, the new woman, I'm going to call her the new woman. How would you tell the difference between a new woman who is merely acquiring the things that men have had and therefore is capable of exhibiting masculinity the same way that anything can just acquire a new thing if it's allowed to acquire it? And how would you distinguish what they've acquired from an idea of masculinity? Come on, we have another guest. Do you want to be on camera or off camera?
Oh.
Hey.
We're taping, so.
Oh, are you?
So yeah, so just sit here. I think this is just how it is. This is Hugh. See, okay, this is a good point to illustrate how the feminine principle works. Or in my mind is that you can never know what's going to happen in the feminine principle. I mean, obviously I invited people, and I'm glad to have you show up, but I didn't know he would show up. And so one of the things I think is really important to understand about the feminine principle is it's not how well you make a plan, it's how well you respond to things that happen. To me, that's a highly developed feminine side of a person, which is capable of reacting elegantly as opposed to absurdly when something unexpected occurs. That to me is exactly illustrative of the feminine principle. Now, how well I'm doing right now, and how well all of us are doing right now, I'm not here. That's not my point. Maybe I'm doing badly, maybe not. But the idea of how well you react as opposed to how well you figure out who you are and what you're going to do and what stand you're going to take, So to me that's really important, and it's another case of here. This is an idea. See, the idea of reacting in the moment and being either elegant or sort of crude and reacting not very elegantly as a measure of how developed one's femininity is. That's not women. I mean, that's sort of traditionally associated maybe with women, but not necessarily have to be tied to women. It's okay, what if we had an idea as opposed to just people? What if there was an actual sort of philosophical or spiritual principle that existed that was only attached to women historically, but it doesn't necessarily have to be attached to women, and it's not a way of dictating what your options are. See, so for me, the idea, I like women. I'm not saying I don't like women, but I think that if we're going to have a lecture or an episode of unlicensed psychology, my goal in this case is to get at an idea. It's get at the idea of the feminine, as opposed to get at what is a woman. Because women will have a lot of things in common. If you watched the last lecture, I was saying something let's say a man has a 75% association with the masculine principle and 25% feminine. And then the average woman might be 75% associated with the feminine principle and 25% masculine. And there's no rules. There's no rules saying you have to be 75% masculine and 25, you know. So that's the goal, is like, is there an actual principle? Is there something that's more than just women and men as they are concretely in the world? You know, so that's...
Have you studied Taoism?
Yeah, this is sort of derived from Taoism. I mean, to a
Or how
large
about-
extent, it's like yin. This lecture is
How
about
about
is about yin.
How about if there's only 5% of people that is actually ascribable to either masculine or feminine, and 95% is ascribable to just like peopleness?
Yeah.
Let's say.
So
It's
how?
not like genderizable or something.
Yeah, and then
Not even like, you know.
yeah. So let's
How
say
about
like yeah. So the Tao symbol is like you got your white yin, which is the masculine principle with the black dot to suggest that it contains the feminine, and then the black, you know, yin thing with the white dot contains the masculine. So maybe like neutral. What is that? That's like neither yang nor yin. That's like some kind of gray. It's like maybe it's you should have one gray circle, right? And so now either that's like a higher truth or it's like a lower truth. Either it's more advanced than thinking of the idea of masculine and feminine, or it's less advanced. It's a consciousness that hasn't even distinguished the idea of masculine and feminine at all. So I don't know if it's more advanced or less advanced to think of, you know, like...
I mean, you could just talk about, you know, Taoist kind of thing, which doesn't really genderize it that much, doesn't ascribe it to genders
I know,
as much as to just, you know, more general philosophical terms.
Yeah.
Of like, you know, receptive and active, passive,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah.
It's true.
It doesn't really genderize it, you know.
I know, and then that's the whole argument. It's like, how much can I literally say that what I'm calling the masculine principle is actually masculine as opposed to just its own principle? You know, one thing I do think in this culture, I think that there's like a push towards the neutralization. There's a push towards wiping the slate clean and saying all men have to act, all women and men, they're the same and they have to manifest the same way, and, you know, to be a responsible man is the exact same thing as being a responsible woman. There's no gender roles. There's definitely a push towards that in the culture at this time. But my problem with it is that, one, maybe, I mean, you may get somewhere with it, or you may lose ground if you do that. Like you may like have less understanding if you eliminate ideas than you would if you like fully follow through the idea completely. My idea is to like, if I can fully follow through, it's like I want to pull the masculine and the feminine out of actual men and women so that they can be understood as principles. And then if a man like identifies with that, then it's like, well, I identify with that traditional masculine. And if a woman identifies with it, then she identifies with the traditional masculine. But if like you don't, I also feel really strongly that the genders have really strong distinctions even in real life.
May I just two things. First, in Buddhism, there's two different paths towards enlightenment. One is compassion, and the other one is wisdom. But for most of the people I know, when you ask, well, which is masculine, which is feminine, most would say wisdom is male and the compassion is female, and that is wrong. In Buddhism, wisdom is the feminine side and compassion is the male. Second thing I like to point out, I don't know what the feminine principle is, but I think you have two different hemispheres to the mind, and what little I know is that the right hemisphere is the more creative, the more loving, the softer, the we as opposed to the I. The left hemisphere is what we traditionally would refer to as masculine traits, being logical, traditional, using the left brain to drive a car. The I, it's the fighting as opposed to the loving, and so I think we have both of that within each of us, and in today's society I think we ought to lean more towards the feminine side because of the shit that the masculine traits have brought about in Western civilization.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll just try to talk about that last point. It's like the idea that men have brought shit to the world. Well, that's making a distinguish, you know? Like if you say that, well, the men that bring the shit to the world are being masculine, they're acting like such men, or they're overly embodying the masculine principle, then that is acknowledging that there is a masculine principle. You know, like if that's what is being said, that the
Yeah, going to war is a masculine principle. Finding a way around
like
it.
Mars, yeah, like Mars versus Venus.
Is feminine, whereas digging in is more masculine. Digging in, being stubborn, or maybe having someone saying, well, he's sticking to his guns, and you know he's a good man for it. Whereas he's wishy-washy because all he does is compromise like those, you know.
Yeah.
So I think we need more of the other side. I don't know if too many women have taken us to war, do you?
Well, they haven't had a chance.
Margaret Thatcher, Elizabeth I.
Yeah, give them a
Margaret
chance.
Thatcher,
Sorry.
can she be elevated as the feminine principle?
She's a woman.
I know
That's
she's
my
a
whole
woman,
point.
but is it the feminine principle that she used, or was
That's
it
my whole
the
point.
Iron Lady?
She is a woman, though.
The Iron Lady.
So
She was using masculine traits.
But are you against? Yeah, that's the question. Is it valuable at all to bother ascribing the two principles? You could call them yin and yang, because they don't. At least I don't know Chinese, and I don't know what yin and yang mean in Chinese. But they don't seem like directly related to men and directly related to
I think
women.
what you're saying is she was using masculine traits, but they existed within her, and she was a woman.
Oh yeah.
That's
And she
what you
used it wisely. But again,
I understand.
I'm thinking of Golda Meir. She went to war, I guess, to defend herself, whereas Thatcher went for the Falkland Islands. Give me a break, come on.
I feel like to have this discussion in the context of all these things that we've been talking about you know, gendered society and women and men, there almost needs to be a disclaimer of we're talking about the feminine principle and the masculine principle with the understanding that every individual person may have a combination of these traits. So that when we talk about it, it's not women are like this and men are like this. It's like these are principles, and we all have elements of each of them in ourselves.
Confusion is coming.
Yeah.
Well, it's
And if we can say that and talk in that context, then we might have the conversation might be able to go further.
It's not that it can't. I have a huge. So you say like, well, like say somebody's father went away, and they say, well, I never had a father, and they say, well, the boy never had a father. No wonder he's wishy-washy, you know, like, no wonder.
Thirsty.
In other words, like we still use the idea. We still use the idea of masculine and feminine, even if we're not trying to. Like they say, Mother Earth. Like, and everybody's like, oh, of course, it's Mother Earth. Of course, I know what that means. I don't have to you don't have to tell me what the feminine principle is in order for me to know what you mean when you say Mother Earth, even though technically the Earth doesn't have a gender. And so my point, well, one of my points is that it's not just a matter of like trying to get at principles that are not being used and that could help us be enlightened, but it's also getting at principles that are already being used but aren't even being acknowledged as being used. like the hippie movement is associated with mothers and femininity somehow, like going back to the earth, and there, it's like we do use it. We use the idea. We already use the idea.
Well, how about talking about, first of all, I think there is a place for thinking dualistically, dividing anything into dualistic elements. I think there's a place for that, but there's also limitations to it. Saying that, if you're a scientist, you can look and look at like magnetism and see that there's attractions and repulsions. So you could look at everything and say, okay, what attracts and what repulses. And that could be one form of like yin and yang, essentially, or, you know what I mean? So you could look at anything and find a dualistic way to look at it. But I think that when you talk about masculine and feminine principles, it just throws all this like cultural stuff in there too, like immediately. So, which is not necessarily bad, but it just means that it's like,
but it's
complicated very quickly.
I know. I would just argue that it's cultural stuff we already use.
I mean, maybe
like we're already immersed in.
Is that the point of what you're trying to get at? Is
I would love to live in a world where
dualism within our society as expressed through gender roles or gender concepts, like.
Yeah, but also just the simple fact that a huge number of people have been thinking in these ways for a long time. That I know, no, it's perfect point. It's sort of like, why don't you just talk about the ideas, like call them yin and yang, and not attach them to genders?
I think you can even use that vocabulary of the feminine and the masculine if you want to. The question is, are we talking about concepts and principles that are sort of universal, or are we talking about reality? Are we talking about women and men and how they express these things?
Well, there are some biological elements to why you would call the feminine principle feminine and masculine principle masculine.
And is that what's important to you with this lecture?
I don't want to ignore biological elements. I don't want to ignore biology. I guess I'm a big fan of biology. I think it, like if you study species from, all manner, all regions, and you find certain behaviors, and sexual reproduction is one of nature's biggest wins in terms of sexual reproduction being a big deal throughout almost all of nature. There are some species that reproduce asexually. But for some reason, sexual reproduction. So that's sort of what we're talking about.
Oh, that's a really good point. That's a very good point. That's a good place to start from if you want to.
We already started. We can continue from it.
Well,
In my
that's a good place that's a good grounding kind of idea that this is, sexual reproduction is widespread throughout all of nature. And so why is that the case and what is it?
Yeah, and then you look at, across species, are there commonalities between males and females? And there are different subgroupings, like in dogs and wolves, chimpanzees, baboons. In the males, you have like these strong hierarchies of men, and there's like a dominant male, and they really beat each other up really bad to be the one. And so that's one element that's common among males, is this idea of like the combat between the two ones for being the king of the hill. So that's one common feature of males.
Well, I think I'm not a scientist, but or a biologist, but I do know that there's an incredibly widespread variety of like power structures relating to gender and sexual reproduction, and also sexual habits of all kinds of animals and plants. And it's so actually my impression of like sex itself is that it's this incredibly variegated thing that yeah, there might be some generalizations you could make, but it would be a little bit risky to do that without actually being, a scientist, a biologist.
Okay, so I just dive. My attitude is I see myself as smart enough. I just dive right into biology and think about it like I'm allowed. I think of myself as smart enough to play the role of a scientist with regard to looking at what's out there and formulating, gathering enough data. So that's just my own, attitude about myself, is that I'm smart enough to be like a biologist. I've watched enough nature videos to get a sense of like a lot of the variety that's out there.
You watch those videos, you might be getting the underlying normative brainwashing aspect of American society that's creating all these like TV videos. And you might be getting an extremely limited view of what life is about watching, Discovery Channel. I would be very suspicious of personally of TV and the general trend of sorts of shows you would see on there.
I just personally have never felt like I was inhibited by my access to knowledge or by my intelligence in terms of investigating the realm of biology. I go into biology with full force. I'm like, let's what's out there? What is out there what's common? What are the common patterns? For one thing, there's just a lot of common patterns, and some of them are, as far as males, there's two sort of competing patterns. One is where you have to beat the other males, and those will be like baboons. They'll just beat each other up until one's still standing, and that'll be the dominant male, and he'll get lots of the women or the females. But peacocks, birds have a different thing, and insects, there's a whole different thing with the males of those species, which is that they don't have to impress other males, and they don't have to beat other males, but they still have to impress something, which is the females. And so it's there's just two patterns. One is dominating the males, and that being in some species that is very prominent. And so I'm as far as my confidence in my ability to go in there and think of myself as a scientist, I don't lack that kind of confidence. But maybe it's just who I am and my personal experience of life that gives me the level of ability to be able to think I can see that. I just think birds are really interesting, like the way the males, they only need to impress the females by and large. There are some species where the females actually are the ones who choose the mates, and other species where sometimes the females have somewhat of a say, but other times it's just a matter of one really tough male beating up a whole bunch of other males, and then being the successful breeder as a result.
Exactly. Let me ask you this. Have you thought about asking a woman what they think the feminine principle is?
Well, I do, but they don't have any ideas. Let me know. I'm asking right now.
So the question is, you did think of asking women?
I do. I don't know.
I feel like the context in which we're discussing the feminine principle is sort of too broad for me to really know what kind of a thing we're trying to talk about. Like, is the feminine principle making a baby? Is the feminine principle being in the darkness? I don't know the context that we're discussing the feminine principle in right now.
Yeah.
And that makes it really hard to...
My question is related to that and related to something else you said before, is I would be willing to discuss the feminine and masculine principles as concepts and ideas, and especially social constructs almost, but not when it comes to actual men and women. Because some of us might be, I don't think in the way the feminine and the masculine present themselves as actual people. Some men I know are way more feminine than some women I know, and vice versa. And it depends on your life experience as well. I think they're concepts, and I'm willing to discuss it that way.
Could you give us 2 examples of each? Masculine concept to masculine versus
You can be
People
as
I
loud as you
know,
can.
I
You
mean-
can be as loud as you can be, because the people
Two-
listening.
two
Yeah, I mean,
examples
among
of that.
even, couples I see, because of their personalities, the male displays much more of the feminine because of his simple personality, more acquiescent, easygoing.
Acquiescence, easygoing.
Yeah, and then the woman will be very type A, and everything has to be
Type A
regimented.
mean-
I know so many women like this.
What do you mean by type A?
Very regimented, very organized. Everything needs to be defined. Everything needs to be put in its place. And I know many women like this who are married or partners with men who are very like, okay, you know what, whatever happens, happens. We don't have to, define anything. We don't have to, not everything has to be organized. Take it as it comes. And I know many people like that, who don't fit in my own life experience.
Is one
Am I making
better than
sense?
the other, or do you think they're both needed?
Well, they're kind of like yin and yang. What we're saying, I think that actually when 2 people like that are together, they balance each other out very well. But it doesn't, it's very often not the man who is, more regimented and defining everything and principles. And very often the man can be more feminine,
Gentle,
gentle.
loving, kind, considerate,
Right.
compassionate,
Right.
a doormat. No, I don't mean that. I'm only kidding. Take it off the
That's
record.
not
I
going.
can't.
Right.
I know, yeah, and that's what I'm talking. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, once again, I feel like there are 2 discussions to be had. So having studied a certain amount of queer theory, like there is the whole concept of what is feminine in a personality type and what is masculine in a personality type, and this is how society has created these genders, and this is currently how we understand genders to be, and and the definition of gender and what has been feminine and masculine has changed over the years, and there is this very sort of tangible idea of gender. And maybe this is just me coming into this with a different expectation, but when I think about thinking about the universe and feminine ideals in the universe and masculine ideals in the universe, while we do often take those outside of that sort of grander scheme of things and put them into people and associate them with personality types, I just feel like there is a bigger concept. And if we're here to discuss queer theory, and maybe that's just the way that I know to
What
talk
do you mean by
about that.
queer?
Are you saying
theory?
that
Queer
when you
theory?
say there's a bigger concept, queer? I just don't want the camera to feel like I don't know if it's even picking up your voice, so I don't want to be. I'm worried about that. And so I just wasn't trying to
Yeah, no, that's
be
fine.
like. So you agree that there is a principle, or you're not, you don't have to fully agree, but you're leaning at least towards.
So to answer your question, queer theory, there's been a lot of research, or there's been a lot of discussion about what is gender in the world, and there are theories about ways of existing without gender, and most of the literature that I've read on that has been in the context of queer theory. So there's been tomes and tomes and tomes of things that have been written about this subject that we're discussing. So it's sometimes hard for me to discuss it in this context because I feel like it's like we just need queer theory 101 and then we can all be on the same page and understand what we're talking about. Someone has already invented this wheel, so that like that exists in the world already. So that's my answer to your question. My answer to your question is, I understand the way that we can be talking about these things, and like you brought up Mother Earth, and there's a way that historically and mythologically we've talked about things like Mother Earth, and we've talked about things like heaven, and heaven being a masculine thing, and the earth being a feminine thing, and these sort of larger interplays between these ideas, and I feel like there is a conversation that can happen around that, and I'm sure that there has also been tons of things written, and there's someone else in the world that's saying like, oh my god, these people just need to take Mythology 101 and they'll know what we're talking about. But I don't know that, so I'm not sitting here saying that. I'm sitting here saying I want to take that class. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's just where my interest lies.
Yeah, I mean, one's like a secular revolution in the with queer theory, and then the other is like anthropology. It's like the study of mankind throughout history and what various opinions they've had about. I personally wanted to look for like some kind of roots. Like a lot of my quest is because I'm dissatisfied with what I see and what I encounter. I encounter lack of. I don't like the working models people already have. You know, I mean, you're talking about how you got the type A woman, and then the sort of submissive man, which is a common thing, but sometimes like
I don't even mean submissive as a negative thing.
Yeah,
you're
okay.
Making
The flexible.
You're again making you're making the feminine actually a negative thing. It's
Right.
not a
Okay,
negative
right.
thing. It's a very whole.
It's just what they are.
It's a very whole thing where the person is whole in and of themselves, so they don't need to assert themselves over someone else. Understand? Like they don't need to assert their will over the other person. It's actually a strength.
But also, I think it's my first response to that, and I don't know if it's a complete response or not, is that women's empowerment has led to a situation where that's far more common than
But acquiescence is that could actually be a strength. That's where the person just is not threatened by the wholeness of another person.
Yeah.
They don't need the other person to submit because they're not threatened by the other person being whole. You understand? So they can actually be not a negative attribute.
They could be flexible. They could be. They could be seeing the larger picture and willing to go along with a lot of the smaller right turns and left turns and.
Yeah, but often why the feminine is not considered to be whole because that might be a very threatening idea.
The feminine.
That it's actually an absence of something instead of something entirely different and its own.
Yeah, I mean, what you're doing is you're differentiating actual women, and you're finding details in actual women which make them very sophisticated.
I'm talking about the feminine as a concept, not as a woman.
And then the
as
person
as a feminine.
Then
it's the men that would be threatened.
That's what I'm saying, not as a woman, as a...
The men would be threatened. Just the word submissive, you yourself use it in the negative term.
Yeah, no, I changed it. I agree.
I know, but initially I think that's a masculine knee-jerk reaction sometimes to some of what we consider to be the feminine side, the submissive, stay at home, take care of the children, women that you talked about through most of civilization.
I mean, I think there's another concept that might help to sort of tease out some of the things we're talking about.
Who's we?
And that
Which
is,
one is we? All of us?
so far, things that I've heard all of us talking about.
Yeah.
And that is the concept of power over versus power with. And I think we're confusing, some of what I'm hearing is ascribing like masculine to maybe more like power over and feminine to power with.
For me, masculine was like more of like not power over, but the attitude which wants power over, which wants to control something.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. And I don't think that there necessarily has to be the way masculine principle and feminine principle, so to speak, needs to be defined. I mean, if you're just talking about yin and yang, it wouldn't necessarily be power over. It could be more like, clarity, energy, force could also be applied, but maybe it would be a gentle force too. It wouldn't have to be power over. It could be power with. You could still have force playing out in a scenario of power with other people.
You could, but I personally always thought of that as like a feminine way of having power.
Well, I mean, so then like I'm just trying to like disentangle the elements of like power from masculine and feminine. I think there is a way to talk about, yin and yang without ascribing them to power, directly. I mean,
yeah.
And actually, I think that's actually a lot of probably what feminism and queer theory talks about, is how can people play out these roles, these gender roles, whoever wants to play out whatever role, without ending up ascribing to power over other people, and constantly maintaining contact with the concept of power with, and thereby empowering everyone who's involved, no matter what gender role they're taking at the moment. So does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. I personally think that the fact that I'm trying to hold a lecture on the feminine principle, once again, to my mind, it once again is like indirectly illustrating another fact of the feminine principle, which I always think of as you think you know what it is and then it recedes. And as far as holding a lecture on the feminine principle, you can't ever finish defining it, because by definition it doesn't want to be defined. And so, yes, there's a huge amount of nuances, and we have to it's like the responsible thing to do is dissect into as many details as can, because you have all these exceptions and variations on the themes involved, and you have the basic question of whether or not these principles, the principles that I'm interested in are in fact masculine or feminine, or if they're just these other principles that exist in a kind of philosophical or spiritual or religious realm, and they're just only traditionally attached to men and women because men and women have traditionally attached themselves to those principles. But now that we live in the modern world, we have all sorts of information and all sorts of different ways of doing things. Then all of a sudden, it's like the woman wearing the pants, and the idea of like the woman, she's the one who wears the pants in the family, and the pants are sort of like what the man would wear if he were the man or something like that. The idea of the pants being kind of like more masculine, whereas maybe I guess the dress or something would be feminine. But we still, I don't know if that's going out of fashion to say the person who wears the pants or whatever. And of course, the benefits of somebody who is an easygoing person and doesn't like wear the pants, but might actually be a cooler person in the end because they're being easygoing is a virtue as opposed to like a negative trait. And so that's something I like totally don't know how to respond to right now.
Maybe you ought to say breadwinner. Usually the male was the breadwinner.
Yeah, I'm just referring to the idea of the pants, because breadwinner is definitely it's suitable for the modern age because it's gender neutral, anyone can win bread. There's nothing saying that, there's nothing masculine or
But
nothing feminine
what
about
if one is the
winning
breadwinner and the other one is the stay-at-home spouse who's a male?
Yeah, the new man.
So, who's wearing the pants? I mean, what I'm saying is the breadwinner used to be.
Yeah, the breadwinner is like a neutral way of saying wearing
Yeah.
the pants. But breadwinner is like a newer. I'm just saying like the whole idea of wearing pants.
So just for me, though, we're talking about marriage, and I guess goes with the feminine and masculine principle. And I guess we're actually talking about men and women at this point. But what we're talking about is teams. And we're talking about one person taking care of this realm of their life, and another taking care of this realm of their life, who stays home, who goes to work, and both are necessary. So, but interchangeable. And, maybe that social thing we're talking about also applies maybe if you're talking about them as spiritual concepts, that they're both necessary. I forgot what my original point was. Sorry.
How would you,
Yeah.
can you go further with the spiritual aspect? What do you mean by spiritual?
Well, I really thought, and that's what I thought actually in the beginning, I thought that this talk would be about